This is your last chance. After this...
Or should we not follow the advice of the galactically stupid?
That is a nice boulder.
Loaded for speed! Go!
Ladies and gentlemen, coming to you pre-recorded from two undersized apartments in New York City, it's Revenge of the Film Nerds.
There, we're in a tight spot.
I hate when people talk during the movie.
With your hosts, Black Crystal.
I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way.
And Jack Manley.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
A podcast for nerds by nerds.
Oh, you betcha, yeah.
Failure is not an option.
And now, here are your hosts, Black Crystal and Jack Manley.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another amazing episode of Revenge of the Film Nerds. It's your girl, BK, and here with me is my amazing, extraordinary co-host, Jack Manley.
We are getting into the dog days of November, but you know what? A couple of great films always makes it a worthwhile time to be alive. How are you, BK?
I am doing quite wonderful this evening. I'm glad you asked. Especially when we're going to be talking about one of my personal favorites. I feel like everything we do on here is starting to become my favorite. But this one is very close to my home. And I don't know about you, Jack, but I am so excited to be bringing this to the podcast.
It's not often you and I seem to have these cultural references from our childhood that come together and converge like this, but we've finally got one. So it's your choice. I need you to lay it up for our listeners.
Oh, yeah, here we go. We are going to be talking about the legendary, the iconic movie, one of the best movies of all time, in my opinion, and that is Jumanji 1995.
Yes, indeed. Directed by Joe Johnston, written by Jonathan Hensley, Jim Strain, and Greg Taylor, and based on the children's book Jumanji by Chris Van Allsburg. Now, I had this when I was young. My mom used to read this to me all the time. You're telling me you've never heard of Jumanji, the children's book, BK?
No, I grew up like where the wild things are. Like, I literally found out this was a novel during our watch party with the community. So I was kind of surprised, but I shouldn't be surprised at this point because usually some of the best stuff has some sort of awesome source material.
You said it yourself in the Spider-Man episode. Everything these days is an adaptation, but we are genuinely a richer people for having a great family film like this in our lives. And I think we all know the story, BK, but what would you say to sum up Jumanji to somebody who's been living under a rock and has never heard of this?
Oh, man, where to begin? Because I feel like a summary doesn't do it justice, but the intrigue is all you need. What happens when a mysterious board game finds its way to a young man? I would just leave it at that. I wouldn't want to tell anyone anything else and make them go through the journey that I was forced to go through.
It's a wonderful, fun film where it reveals itself to you in very elegant ways. But it takes that young man and that board game 26 years of a leap into the future and into a world that has been largely left desolate by the absence of his presence. And he has to help two kids who have stumbled upon the game intent upon finishing it to get to the end of that journey. And through it, discover a new part of himself. It's a really elegant film, told through some very big, and I mean big, Hollywood set pieces.
Oh, yeah. And I think the reason why we really wanted to have Jumanji on the podcast is for the story, for the culturalness, but really for the technical work that went into this beast. When I tell you, there is so much special effects, so much animatronic scenes, miniatures, and the acting alone. I'm geeking out here. But for real, as much as this is such a great, heartfelt family film that is genuinely amazing for all ages, this film is a testament to its very existence in time. It is a great representation of film, I think, from 1995 with its very unique use of resources, I'll say, because we're going to get into it, Jack. But before I get to the finer tuned things of the actuality and telling of the story, I need to know where and how and the heck this story came from. Like, you like actually read this as a kid? Like, you're not lying?
Oh no, I got to see the Rhino Stampede in the dining room before this movie even existed.
Was what's his name, Ellsberg, like a household name for you? Because I like grew up with Where the Wild Things Are or stuff like that. So who is this guy that created such a weird and unique story that is Jumanji?
Let me blow your mind before I get into him real quick, because Chris Van Allsburg is not only responsible for Jumanji, he's also responsible for the Polar Express.
Wait, what? You're kidding.
You know Chris Van Allsburg, you just didn't know you knew Chris Van Allsburg.
Oh my gosh, that must, oh, I'm thinking about the art now. It's got to be beautiful. Where do we get this amazing intellectual, I don't know, mind to be able to tell such a captivating yet fanciful story? I don't know. I just always assume an author that tells a story like this has some crazy backstory.
Well, Van Allsburg actually kind of lived and was raised in the idyllic 1950s American dream. He was born in Grand Rapids, Michigan in 1949, and his family ran a dairy business in the state. And he basically spent his entire life in Michigan with his parents and his sister, living that kind of ideal lifestyle. And this all wound up with him going to school in the state at the University of Michigan and being in their School of Architecture and Design. And this is where a young kid who honestly, BK, had been more comfortable with a football in his hand than a pencil, discovered an instant love of drawing and illustrating when he picked up a pen in a freshman level drawing class.
You're kidding. I can't imagine that. I'm like a theater nerd, so I immediately put myself in that situation of the equivalent as a jock, where I'm like, okay, I do my whole life, I'm training for this, and then I go to college and I take a random drawing class and I'm a protege? Like, what?
Well, it led him to really start seeing himself in his life as an artist, and it culminated with him getting a degree in, of all things, sculpting and sculpture. And that was really where his passion lied, to the point where this is the point in his life where he moves to New England and gets a master's in sculpting at the Rhode Island School of Design, eventually setting up a studio in 1975 in Providence, Rhode Island.
I guess he really doubled down there. And sculpting is so interesting that you say that, because as I looked at some of the art from the works, there definitely is that this brush style I see a bit in there that leads me to see that leap. I don't know why I'm saying I'm not an art aficionado. So anyone listening here who's got some insider insight for me, please let me know.
Well, I do see what you mean, because if I think back on the illustrations that I saw in my youth, both in Jumanji and Polar Express, they have a very still, very set nature about them. But they also feel as though they're really well informed by somebody who studies at a finite level the figure of a human or another animal. And I think that's really where that style, at least for me, kind of comes into play. But unfortunately for him and sculptors for thousands of years, it's not a business that produces a lot. And so he found himself in the late 70s in a place where he wasn't generating a whole lot of income for his family. Most of it was coming from his wife, Lisa, who was a local TV producer.
I'm curious, is this the point in which he takes on some sort of new project or kind of gets the inspiration for the story?
A great family film and a great children's author both get their start here because Chris's wife, Lisa, convinces him to turn his sketching into picture books. You see, he kind of thought of drawing and writing as a hobby at the time. He was really inspired to be a sculptor, but he wanted to do something with his drawing and provide for himself, and so he decided to really start building on these concepts. And this eventually led his wife to connect him with children's author David Macaulay, who had made multiple books that were turned into TV series at this time. And Macaulay, in turn, introduces Van Allsburg to his editor Walter Lorraine at Houghton Mifflin. And at this point, it was almost a given. He quickly gets signed by Mifflin and by Lorraine to do children's works.
Wow, that is such an interesting jump. Shout outs to Lisa. Okay, looking out for him.
Pretty poignant for this kind of story.
It is such a child's book story to me, even in its creation. Like, I'm kind of geeking out a little, Jack.
He releases in 1979 his first ever book, The Garden of Abdul Ghazazi. And it's a very simple story. It's a picture book about a gardener who turns dogs into ducks. And this would quickly become a hallmark of his style, was his deep influence in his illustrations by the Surrealists. He really loved the idea of juxtaposing subjects and situations with ordinary life.
Wow. Okay. So when you mean like juxtapose with their ordinary life, elaborate that on a bit, because I feel like I know what you mean when you say that in reference to Jumanji, but at the same time, I don't.
Well, Von Allsburg saw an opportunity in Jumanji to flesh out a concept that he had thought about since he was a child. You see, he had always had a strong interest in board games and playing them with his family, but he was always vaguely disappointed at the end that the events in the games were pretend. So Jumanji starts because he set to write a story about a board game that actually delivered on what it promised. And the surrealist aspect comes into play because the idea of jungle creatures being in an American home, sort of, putting a lion in a Norman Rockwell painting, if you will, that idea was very alluring to him because of the concept of just how much it was kind of not fish out of water, it was water out of fish in a way.
I like that, though. I get what you mean, though, when you put it like that. It's almost like an opposite play on the everyday. I mean, let's be honest. No offense to Allisberg's picket fence life, but that sounds like it could have been very mundane growing up as a kid, constantly wanting things to be fanciful to that point of thinking that the board game should come to life. I guess it kind of makes sense why that gravitated towards him.
Allsburg makes a very astute observation in interviews that he's done when he's talked about that concept of boredom. He always felt that a big part of childhood was being bored and experiencing boredom and figuring out your own unique ways in which you remedy that. The beauty of that synchronicity in Jumanji is that it comes down to the very name Jumanji, which means in Zulu, many effects. And that's an allusion to the exciting consequences of the game and this ability that the board game gives to turn the world on its head by playing it.
I love that. When I first found out what Jumanji meant, I had a new appreciation for, I don't know, I guess like the world building that has been done with the story. And to find out that it's a story, I go, oh, well, it's a no-brainer. You can't give kids a haphazard world for them to attach to. Like, you got to go all in and immersive.
And more to the point, this is where a lot of the core of the eventual Jumanji film starts coming into play. The story is essentially Judy and Peter finding a game in the park while their mother is out doing errands. The game warns them specifically, do not pick this up and start it unless you plan to finish it. And as they start in their home, these creatures start coming out of the board from the jungle and start breaking the house up. And so it's a very simple children's book of, oh my goodness, we need to get everything fixed before mom comes home. And it's a very simple idea that you can see the backbone of the film come into play from.
I love that. It's very Dr. Seuss in that sense. Classic Dr. Seuss. Oh my gosh, stop. Thing one and thing two. You're destroying everything. Mom's going to be home. So that's why it just screams nostalgic, I think, for everyone generationally and not just youngins out here. And then with its own twist to be just slightly, I think, darker personally than Cat in the Hat. The board game is far more menacing than a mythical cat that doesn't look like a cat. No offense, Cat in the Hat.
It's definitely more menacing than a Dr. Seuss story, but it does have that central resonance to it that made it a standout hit, to the point where it won the most prestigious award in illustrated work for kids in 1982, which is the Caldecott Medal. Have you ever seen a children's book on display with those big gold medals embossed on the front, BK?
Yeah, I have. Is that?
Yeah, that's what that is. And Allsburg has won 2 of those. one for this and one for the Polar Express. And this is what made him and his properties into a hot commodity in the late 1980s. He received numerous offers over this time period to adapt his works, but he ended up turning down all of these projects because most of them were just higher on enthusiasm than they were on capital.
Oh, man. So people were just more excited to work with someone who is poppin' versus actually having the funds to make the vision come to life?
It kind of underscores the value of the stories that he was telling, that people just wanted to come with him with ideas to put his stuff on the screen, and they just didn't have the backing. They just didn't have what it was going to take to reach that vision. And Van Allsburg was very particular about making sure that could be possible with what he had put into these books. But the opportunity, BK, finally presented itself in mid-1992.
That's a little decent chunk of time. That's like almost 10 years. Who is the lucky person to get their foot in the door and get the permission to bring this vision to life?
Well, Van Allsburg's editor, Walter Lorraine, gets a pitch from Sony to bring Jumanji to the screen, and he sets up a meeting for Van Allsburg in Boston to discuss optioning the work. Now, Van Allsburg had been to meetings like this before and had not really been convinced by them, but it just so happened that Peter Guber, who at the time was the CEO of Sony Pictures Entertainment following their buyout of Columbia Pictures, actually happened to be in Boston for this meeting because his parents were in the process of selling his boyhood home and he was there visiting them. Guber just legitimately was in town. This wasn't the sort of meeting he was going to take. So in walks Allsburg with Lorraine, and who's sitting there but the head of the company? They were impressed immediately by this kind of strong presence at the meeting. It convinced Van Allsburg to option the book.
Wow, that's so funny. What a fortunate coincidence.
It was a fortunate coincidence, but as so often it is with films that we talk and film nerds, this is when the project almost immediately runs into peril and almost doesn't happen. Because the studio commissions several drafts to adapt the book, and all of them were just absolutely lackluster. Sony was not getting a return on what they had bought, and they were ready to shelve it.
I guess I can imagine, having so many drafts and not having anything to show for it where we're still in the writing phase, let alone talking about budgets. I mean, why even keep it around?
It comes back to the passion of the author to see this project out. At this point, he realizes that he needs to step in, and he does what is called a film treatment. This is the step, if you're a writer in film, between scene cards, writing out the basic outlay of what you want to have happen in your film, and writing out a first draft. And honestly, he said that he did not find the process to be very intimidating. It was something that took him, he felt, less time to tell in words than he had told in pictures. And the result was a draft that really played up the mystery and the surrealist aspects of what he had done initially in his children's book. And it was the strength of this treatment that convinced Sony that the project was worth sticking to. And even though Van Allsburg's draft is not what you see on the screen, it was enough to earn him the all-important story credit on the film.
Well, that's huge. I mean, I feel like having the original author at least do something like a film treatment or a storyboard or anything of that nature just makes the most sense, and it ensures at least the major elements get highlighted, even if the story does change.
Not only that, but this project early on found a director who had a specific vision for what he wanted to bring to the screen with this project in Joe Johnston. Because Johnston agreed to do this film, it just so happened the very week that Jurassic Park came out in theaters and would change the landscape of special effects in film forever. And he realized upon seeing this script that everything that was contained within it was now possible. And more than that, he already had a very strong special effects acumen from his work on the 1989 classic Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. So between Van Allsburg's passion for the project and Johnson's real vision for what he wanted to put on screen, you couldn't have had a better creative backbone here.
And you couldn't have a better flippin' cast. Can we take a moment to give appreciation for the characters and the actors that were all involved in this? Honestly, quite frankly, every single one of them threw in their whole passion to make this experience awesome and translate it on film.
And it seems like it's again serendipity that brings us this kind of cast. I mean, I can't think of a better Alan Parrish than Robin Williams. I can't think of a better Judy than a very talented young Kirsten Dunst. But BK, this wasn't a serendipitous casting process. This was a toil that got very intertwined with how the film was going to be financed. And again, it was somewhere where the film could have ended up dying if the right set of circumstances hadn't transpired.
Really? Because I'm like, I don't know, it's a children's story for me, and we're talking Sony, so I'm thinking heavy casting situation. We're looking for the right people who are hot off the streets.
Absolutely. Moreover, it's a big budget Hollywood film. This thing was going to cost $65 million when all was said and done. You have to have an A-lister attached to it to make it worth the studio's while. And they had just the right guy in mind who was going to be perfect for this project. And it's Tom Hanks, and he can't commit because Apollo 13 is about to come out.
No, but also, okay, Apollo 13 is fire, though. We might need to put that on the pod.
I think we might have to examine that because actually, BK, random tangent, film I haven't seen.
What? All right, you heard it here first. We're going to have to figure that one out. But Tom Hanksy, too busy going to space on Apollo 13, trying to fit a square into a circle. Is there a backup? Is there someone else they had in line? Or was it just fate? Or
They do have a second choice in mind. They are going to try to get, for the role of Alan Parrish, Bruce Willis, and he can't do it because he's working on Die Hard with a Vengeance.
also, I can't visualize Bruce Willis in this film. I'm sorry, I can't do it.
He was a guy in the 90s who had that vibe of, we have a big budget film, we have to consider Bruce Willis. But they went through a who's who of both comedians and Hollywood leading men. Dan Aykroyd, Chevy Chase, Sean Penn, Kevin Costner, Richard Dreyfuss, Michael Douglas, Rupert Everett, Harrison Ford, Alec Baldwin. These were all names that came up, but they couldn't find their star. Now, it gets a little bit murky here, but at this point, TriStar Pictures comes into focus, and they say, listen, we're happy to finance your project, and we can get you a lead actor, but we're going to finance it only on the condition that your star is Robin Williams.
Wait a second. Is there some back-end information between TriStar and Robin Williams? Isn't TriStar Pictures another studio, or?
They had certain connections as a major studio and would later have connections to Columbia Pictures. But honestly, I couldn't find anything in my research about a direct connection between Robin Williams and TriStar. But they had the ability, regardless, to get the A-lister on this film. The only problem is that Robin Williams turned down the project initially because he was not happy with the script he was sent.
Ooh, to have that power, though, because I wonder if he knows that it hinges on him being the star, right? I mean, the whole movie's being backed by him being the lead, and he's not happy with the script. They got to make the changes, I assume, right?
It's where the creative backbone of this film shines, because at this point, Joe Johnston says, okay, we're going to beat this draft into shape, and we're going to do it as quickly as possible. So along with Jonathan Hensley, Jim Strain, and Greg Taylor, the writers on the final draft of this script, they get together and they pull an all-nighter to shift around scenes, polish up the draft, and end up getting it into the shape that it needs to be. And they present it to Robin Williams a few days later. He likes the rewrite and he agrees to take the role. So this film is on.
Wow, I didn't know I had a story like this. I was already fascinated by the film itself, but to find out the little bits and pieces like this, I'm already geeking out.
It's a really wonderful thing that he was able to come into this, because I think he just lends a real gravitas and a real light to the Alan Parrish role that I don't think another actor could have done. It's weird to see Robin Williams in that action adventure kind of vibe, but at the same time, he pulls it off because his acting performance never lets you lose that family film grounding. It's something that he has, in my lifetime certainly, always excelled at, whether it's Jumanji or something that is near and dear to my heart like Mrs. Doubtfire. And that ability he has to ground his performances in very understated familial terms, the way that he's able to convey his presence as a family man, is something that I think is really strong here in this film and allows the film to convey its messages through him.
I love that you said that. Was going to even genuinely argue that this is the film that I think established him in that light, because the next film I thought of him playing that similar type of a character or types of movies he'd be in. After this, a lot of it started to be that character. I mean, before and earlier on, I think of him being in like Dead Poet Society, and that's not the same Robin that we see in Jumanji. I feel like we see a very refined actor in that film, and I could argue probably a very big launching point for the next cycle of his life there.
And he got some really wonderful co-stars on this film too, through, again, pretty prolonged audition processes. But being matched on screen both by Bonnie Hunt as Sarah Whittle and by Kirsten Dunst as Judy Parrish, to say nothing of Bradley Pierce as Peter, he really lucked out by the fact that, again, with Sarah Whittle, Kirstie Alley was slated to have that role, but she was busy with the Olsen twins film, It Takes Two, and so Bonnie Hunt, after a who's who casting process in Hollywood, ends up landing that role. Kirsten Dunst comes onto the picture because she had the right array of experience as a young actress from being in an adaptation of Little Women as well as Interview with the Vampire. Actually, believe it or not, BK, beating out a young Scarlett Johansson based on experience.
No way. I can't even imagine anyone else for this film. Honestly, I think the casting was just, again, so well done given the circumstances.
It was a cast that would really cement its bonds and reaffirm what a wonderful group it was through the shooting process of this film. Now, it was a fairly grueling process. They ended up shooting over 5 months, and they ended up shooting on both coasts. The parish house and the interiors were shot in Vancouver, British Columbia, with the exteriors being shot in the spring in Keene, New Hampshire.
Honestly, the moment you said that, because I have been around both areas, I immediately said yes. Judging by the style and then knowing they are separate places, how well matched they were is just so cool. That is chef's kiss.
They really had a great aesthetic for this film in where they chose to shoot and where they chose to create a fake New England town to serve as the avatar for all of this board game's destruction. And destruction's an interesting word here because Joe Johnston came onto the set worried that Robin Williams was going to end up destroying his process due to being a notorious ad-libber.
Yeah, I actually heard that rumor before as well. Like, you get actors, not just Robin Williams, but he was definitely one of them, who go off script, do their own thing, or very high energy. And that kind of is difficult to work with at times, especially when you're working on a tight schedule with a film and this is family oriented. You're throwing a lot of cards in the wild. But I heard that the relationship was actually pretty good, surprisingly.
Well, Robin Williams is unique in his ad-libbing. I mean, you've seen him do stand-up before. When he starts, you do not stop him. He is a whirlwind. And that's what Johnson was worried about, that something that he really meant to be a tightly structured story would get derailed by that instinct. But ever the professional, Robin Williams not only found a way to balance those needs on set, but he kind of made himself into a leader on set. He worked out a deal with Johnston where they would shoot everything in a very tight and scripted way and then would poke and prod him a little bit before they moved setups to get 1 or 2 takes for himself or 1 or 2 takes for Bonnie Hunt to really allow themselves to thrive in their performance. And some of those improvs do end up making the final cut, most notably the background conversations and arguments you hear between Alan and Sarah.
I love that. I mean, and one of those happens in one of the most iconic scenes in the film. So I'm so excited to learn that those are improv, because I guessed that it was. So to find out that's true, I'm like, okay, cool, totally. Like, that's so funny.
You wouldn't expect a Hollywood screenwriter to remember to bring up the imagined boyfriend in Alan Parrish's head in 1969 during the process of rolling before the stampede. But that's a clear, beautiful improv right there.
Oh, yeah. It is so good. I always wonder, I was like, did they really write that? There's no way.
I think that Robin Williams found a way to vent and use his improvisational energy in kind of a genius way on this set. Because while he did get those one or two improvs at the end of each setup, he would spend his time between takes doing impressions on set. Stuff that would fly over Bradley Pierce and Kirsten Dunst's head as little kids, but they still got cracked up by the way that everyone on set gets cracked up by Robin Williams. And it got to the point where, according to Jonathan Hyde, who plays Sam Parrish and Van Pelt in a double role, the entire cast was getting in on the act between setups. They would drop totally their characters from Jumanji and would start just ad-libbing with each other, creating random characters that they wanted to play to let out their energy.
I love that. And I think that was got to be so fun to be around as a child actor. Free knowledge for you, free experience. Even if you don't understand all of it, you're being surrounded by it. That's such a great atmosphere. I'm so jealous.
It wouldn't just stop on set, because Robin Williams would also take the time to impact the Vancouver comedy scene. Every Monday night during the filming of Jumanji in Vancouver, Williams would go out to a local comedy club where he would spend about 90 minutes every night doing improv with locals, followed by just relentlessly doing 90 minutes of stand-up. 3 hours of free Robin Williams comedy and experience at the fingertips of Vancouver's comedy scene at the time. It just blows the mind.
God, what a time to be alive. I would have paid everything to have been there.
It's beautiful that Johnston and Williams were able to come up with that synergy. But there's another equally beautiful, I think, story about synergy on set between the relationship of Joe Johnston and Bonnie Hunt. Because when it got to the first day of shooting, Bonnie went into her performance and Johnston was not happy.
Yeah, I heard that story too. And that Johnston thought that Bonnie was playing too hard into the role, doing the most, I guess.
He really did think that she was going too over the top with her performance. And he was trying to get her to tone it down a little bit, really giving her the note to just be a little bit less. And so Hunt pulled him aside and discussed with him at a very earnest level the complex psychology and trauma that she had put into her backing for who this character is. And really what she was doing in the role to humanize Sarah and the experiences that she had gone through.
Genuinely, one of my favorite performances is Bonnie Hunt's. She is probably the only one that I feel really represents my feelings if I were in that scenario of being completely traumatized. I mean, let's be honest, the kids take the scenario far more willingly than I would have as a child. Even though they're freaked out, they still are like, all right, well, guess we're playing the game. To see someone really suffer trauma present on the film and have to confront that trauma. I mean, I fell in love with her the moment she's calling up her therapist being like, hi, I'm having an episode, maybe. And it just hits so hard. So it's so awesome to hear that that was coming from Bonnie's own interpretation as an actress to bring to that character.
And Johnston, moreover, upon hearing this argument from Bonnie Hunt, deferred to her interpretation of the performance and allowed her to play up and act out that trauma. But meanwhile, BK, another actor facing trauma on this film was young Peter, Bradley Pierce. But this was for an entirely different reason. Bradley, to transform into a monkey over the course of the film, had to sit every day for 3.5 hours to have practical makeup put on.
Oh, poor baby. Aw, that's gotta be so rough. 3.5 hours for the face. I'm glad it's not a full body situation. We've heard of some worse makeup times, but 3.5 hours for anybody is pretty rough.
Staying still for 5 minutes when you're 12 is next to impossible. But what got him through it was having a mentor and a friend on set in Robin Williams. Now, to back this up really quickly, Robin Williams had gone through, at the time, one of the most extensive prosthetic makeup processes in film history for the 1993 Chris Columbus film, Mrs. Doubtfire. And him sitting for all this effects makeup work on his face informed him with experience that he would then impart on Bradley Pierce, because he would come during some days, sit with Bradley Pierce while he was having this makeup done, and advise him on that process.
Oh, how sweet and heartfelt. And I'm crying already. I'm just imagining the vibes. I'm set. What an experience to have. And to have someone there be able to be your mentor through it, occupy your time, not be tossed in the deep end. Because sometimes as a child actor, you can be. And a lot of the time, building the world and the atmosphere behind the scenes is just as equally important as it is to convey it through the screen.
Robin Williams being at the heart of this film turned out to be the biggest blessing it had. I mean, shout out to TriStar for really forcing that decision through, because he would do little things. Like, he would give Bradley Pierce and Kirsten Dunst the respect of adult actors, understanding both that Bradley Pierce was somebody who needed effects work help and needed to be able to get through this process, and also respecting Kirsten Dunst's unique intelligence and intellect as one of the smarter women working in Hollywood. And it would even go further with Bradley Pierce, because Williams' oldest son at the time was around the same age, so on days off, he would invite Pierce out with him to go to the movies or go to the zoo and just be a kid and have that presence of Robin on the film, not only as an acting compatriot, but also as a father and as a friend. And really, when you're involved in a film like this that requires so much special effects care and requires so much investment, it's one of the best things he could have possibly had.
Gosh, to think that this is what it took to create something so magical, I just never would have thought. We haven't really heard a story that's really been this hingent upon someone being so integral to its very creation.
It's rare that you come across a film like this where, despite all the collaboration, there is that energetic center to it. And I think that's a special thing for a film like this, for an environment like this, where you have young actors having to adjust to working with CGI, running away from a screaming swarm of bats despite the fact that there are no bats in there, freaking out about getting sucked into a board game in an effect you're not going to see until the final cut's on the screen. And it's amazing to me that the core of this film could stay so earnest and so in simpatico about what they wanted to achieve that it made the technical process that goes on top of this film into something that could shine out without being glaring. And I think it's a good place to start bridging into the technical discussion, because this film is, dare I say it, a moment in history for effects work.
Oh, it really is, Jack. Quite frankly, I think this is probably some of the best work in mixing and merging all of the technical elements. They really had to pull out all the stops here to make this vision come to life. Things are just done so well. Like, there's a lot of animals throughout the movie, but Jack, there's not a single real animal in this film.
I thought at least they had like a trained bat on the young Sarah's shoulder.
No, that would be an animatronic bat. That's the only actual tangible bat on that shoulder scene, but the rest were CGI computer work. And honestly, some of the best computer work of its time, really. They had to invent some of this work to create the visuals that they really wanted, specifically for the stampede scenes.
What I've heard is basically that they created two massive steps forward for CGI, and I'm just really curious what those ended up being.
Well, one is eye sculpt. It's there to create the expressions on the face of the animals. So what's really important there is this is kind of cartoony in a way, and I think the dedication to making sure the animals can show those micro expressions to show that anger and that fear was very, very important. And not just the expressions alone, but also the hair, Jack. They needed to make realistic animals. This was not going to do well in the wake of Jurassic Park. If these dinosaurs can look real, well, these animals better look real. And hair and matching up the hair digitally with the hair on the puppetry and the animatronics was a task that was not prepared for and had to be developed in order to fix and make it as good as we see it in the final product.
Hearing you say those two developments to me, they're both very interesting, very simple ideas. Facial expressions on animals and realistic digital hair. There's something very elegant about making those advances to ground these animals in this film, if I'm honest. I've always noticed some animals that were clearly CGI, like the monkeys, but in seeing the way that they actually look like the monkeys in Chris Van Allsburg's original book, to see them brought to life through these CG processes, it's kind of amazing, because I feel like they both sound, to me at least, like they give you the artistic liberty to make these animals realistic, while, as you said, imbue them with those cartoon qualities, imbue those with those deeper personifications that we get used to with the animals in this film. They're expressive animals. They have their own thoughts and actions that are very motivated by the very emotional response you see reflected on them. It's very, very high-level technical work.
To kind of dive deeper a little bit on the behind the scenes process, which makes it so cool, is even in the drawing room when they were trying to do their initial drafts of the line, they didn't want it to look like just any line. They wanted a sense of fear. They wanted a sense of danger. So they had to go through a lot of mock-ups. And really the big thing was translating those drawn images. And the reason why they're so characterized is they made models of everything. Models that the CGI artist would reference when building out the monkeys. So like that monkey head exists as reference. There is a modeled line there that both teams, whether they're doing animatronic puppetry work or you're doing CGI, they're working from the same reference point that was originally made for this film. It is such a fascinating process. And when you see the end results of the rhino going over the car, or seeing the monkeys in the kitchen and seeing CGI work with practical effects in these scenes being imposed over them, it's fascinating to see how much work goes into it. Because as a kid, you see the rhino bust through the bookcase and you think it's real. But in reality, it was kind of real. It was like a metal rhino. It went through and it was like a blue screen. So like they did like break the bookcases, Jack.
I think that's kind of a lost art in the age of CGI dominant productions. To see the fact that they went to such care blending the practical and the digital together, it warms my heart because I've talked about it throughout this film. I think that Jumanji is it's something that is made with a lot of consideration for what it is and what it needs to achieve. And to hear that the technical process was so finitely done like this, it just undergirds that for me. And I think that's really important. It seems like such a simple thing that you would hope every film would have in the way that it's made, but it seems like the care that was taken in making Jumanji in particular is a big reason why it is so effective, in my opinion, getting across its themes as a family film.
I am so glad that you brought us here, Jack, because I think that is what this film does so well. Aside from its technical aspects, which are literally defining the industry, this film also tells such a fun, relatable story with very, very prominent themes. I am always moved when I hop into this film, no matter what, and I always find something else to gather from it because there are a lot of age groups represented throughout the film and a lot of different characters and their interactions with each other. And I think probably the most prominent one, and I have to ask you, Jack, about this one to defer to you, but I relate to this relationship. And that is the biggest one in this film. And I think that's the father-son relationships throughout the film.
It's funny. Jumanji is very good at conveying its themes in a fun way, but it doesn't shy away from the painful aspects of conflict that result from them. And I think you see that in the way that it conveys father-son relationships. Honestly, when I watch this film, especially as an adult, I find that the real tension and fear in the story isn't coming from what comes out of the board game next. I think it really comes from the fact that the whole situation kicks off because Alan is not able to talk with his dad. It's an inability for them to communicate their inner worlds for each other that is it's a fundamental stumbling block, I think, between all fathers and sons. You know, I'm lucky. I have had one of the best dads in the world, if not the best dad in the world, but I'm biased. Even despite that, my father and I, we have at times had tension. We have had arguments. We have had rows with each other where we have yelled at each other and been unkind to each other. And I think that that's something that every father-son relationship goes through, because you're trying to find the truth of your understanding between each other as people. And a lot of it relies in this film upon the struggle of a father who wants to do the best for his son and care for his son, and a son that wants his father to love him without having to become him. And that extends to both Alan's relationship with Peter, in how he goes from being austere and telling him, like his father did, to act like a man, to becoming a more compassionate role model, as well as his relationship with Van Pelt hunting him down, eventually going from cowering at the very idea that he could come out of the board game to facing his potential death at Van Pelt's hands in the end, because he finally has found that courage through his own growth to become a man. And so when these two reconcile at the end of the film, it's a very sweet moment, because it's not just that the board game is over and that Alan gets to be a kid again. It's that he takes the opportunity to realize the impact that his father has on him, and his father, in turn, is able to understand the impact that his son has on him. And it's a beautiful reconciling of those tensions that, as a son with a wonderful father, it warms me to see those kind of accords, that kind of resolving of tension conveyed on the screen.
It's really great to hear your take on this, because I connect to it as just a regular parental figure, but I know that there is something deeper and something else there with that father-son relationship, specifically with expectations. And I know you mentioned a little bit on mentorship, and this film does not like shy away from directly depicting it and then conveying the message of the change. And I think that's what's so special about it and makes it such a lasting message, even though, you know, I ain't no son, Jack.
There's a degree that every child, I think, deals with it with their parents.
Yeah.
There's unique parts about the father-son relationship that this does convey, but I do think there is a universal quality to that intergenerational relationship. And I think you get to that understanding of those ties that bind us all together with the way this film conveys the impact of Alan's absence. It's very Dickensian in how it plays out, but at the same time, it is its own story about what this world would be like if Alan wasn't in it.
It is. It's almost like one of the original multiverse stories or something of that nature. But in reality, that really is what it is. I know we spent tons of time after our watch party really just talking about the different realities. Well, what if? And here's the new reality now that the game has gone back and he's got to reconcile. But none of that would have been possible. And none of the journey in the story wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for Alan's disappearance and absence in the film. And that absence being very detrimental to the family, and not just the family, but the town itself.
That's a very astute observation, because honestly, I think a big motivator of Alan's growth through the film is the fact that he understands what happened because of his disappearance. His dad gives up on the town's manufacturing heart, the shoe factory, because he wants to pour all his resources into finding his son. Carl, the soul man, played by David Alan Grier, loses a promising career and a forward-thinking creativity as a shoemaker who wants to build a modern sneaker because Alan is not there to admit that he's the one that broke the conveyor belt in the factory. Sarah, who we've talked about her trauma, she overly therapizes herself and becomes a shut-in after witnessing what happened to Alan. And even in a kind of a ex machina that the film throws in, Judy and Peter lose their parents in a skiing accident because the parishes aren't there to warn them not to go. In every aspect of the film, Alan is confronted by just how much his existence means to people. It's a wonderful life. It's very, no, Clarence, I want to live. And it gives Alan that opportunity to bring that experience before he forgets it back to that reconciliation with his father and making a better life for himself.
It really is about how much he does mean. Seeing that next level, I never really thought about it that way. I mean, I can only imagine how Alan was feeling so isolated, insignificant. He was being bullied. He wasn't living up to his father's expectations. He was making mistakes and not owning up to them. Quite frankly, I think he knew what he did at the factory by messing up the shoe and knew it was going to be something bad, saw it happen, and walked away. I have a great feeling that he lived with that guilt inside the board game. And to come back and to try to face it is just such a great story that is far deeper than you realize, hinging on him not being there to be able to grow, to go through it, to be stuck in isolation. He has to live it and try to fix it.
I think that Jumanji is very good about presenting that no event is allowed to happen in a vacuum and that actions have consequences. I mean, yes, it's very, very unsubtle in the fact that you roll the dice and then something comes out of the board game to torment you in the next set piece for the film. That's a given. But if you look at it at a deeper level, the obstacles for all the characters, beyond just Alan's arc, because everybody has a pretty well-rounded arc of our four main characters, the real obstacle comes in learning to understand just how each of their actions have impacted one another. One conflict that I find very interesting that's very subtle is that Judy and her constant lying in the film about what happened to their parents and what their circumstances were is what motivates Peter to finally stop being silent and process his grief over his parents' death and to speak again and to become a more active kid in the story. And that happening in turn makes Judy become a more earnest and honest character throughout. Sarah, in having to re-confront this board game, has to reconnect with reality and understand that her isolation isn't going to allow her to run away from her problems. And it all hits at something that you have talked about very seriously while we've been discussing these themes that I think might be the central point of the film and the central moral, which is the whole story is about facing your fears.
It really is. And I think that that is so special. And that being said, it's special because it is such a great universal thing that I think we all kind of constantly deal with. And what a great family message to tell. But this film does it in such a unique way and presents you the moral of the story at the beginning of the film, almost in a negative light, coming from what will be one of our worst antagonists of the film. And that is Alan's father, where he tells him to man up, you need to face your fears, man. And slowly but surely, that is really what all of the characters have to constantly do throughout the film in order to gain resolution. I mean, Alan needs to stop running away from the conflict in the board game. I mean, you can tell he says he lives in the jungle, but I assume he was always on the move. Now he has to come back into the real world and face that issue, face the game that he didn't finish. It's the same deal with Sarah Weddle as well, where she has to face her trauma or her fears. She was at the point where she was essentially denying her existence and denying the trauma was ever there. Only then is she able to really kind of work on a path to healing, and you can see her stop being the isolated, sheltered person and really become a character in herself only after she is facing the fears of playing the game and working through them and talking through the whole situation. I think it is awesome to have that all come to a climax at the end where Alan is facing his father as his biggest fear in and outside of the game. I mean, it is a great message to bring full circle when we go back in time. We've reset the timeline and we talk to him and we talk about facing our fears, where we confront his father, where we confront the mistakes we made and we work to growth. Having that resolution after facing your fear, I think, is what makes this message stand out the most to me and gets me all butterfly inside.
I think the reason that I gravitate towards it so much is because I think it talks about facing your fears in a very intelligent way, because it's not just about the idea of facing your fears. It's about the fact that it understands that bravery is not the absence of fear. Bravery is doing the right thing and standing up and being yourself even though you're afraid, even if a situation scares you. And that Jumanji, underneath all of the Hollywood artifice, underneath all the big budget, is able to bury that message in there in a very intelligent way. I love that.
I love it too. I'm glad we can bond over this, Jack, because I'm always so nervous when I suggest films because I'm like, I don't know. Is he going to like it as much as me? Is there going to be enough to talk about it? I just kind of want to watch it. When we decided to pick Jumanji, specifically this film, you lit up on it. And I have to say, I think it's just because it's kind of universally good. I mean, doesn't the box office back us up?
The box office certainly shows that there was a resonance to this story because it ends up grossing $262 million worldwide on a $65 million budget. Yet again, BK, you have picked a massive commercial hit for us to review.
Let's go. I did hear that there was a little bit of controversy of this film when it came out initially. I mean, when we're talking about spiders as giant as our heads and monkeys and frightening mosquitoes and terrifying bats and plants that could maybe kill you, I think it might be a little too scary for people out there.
That's an opinion, BK, that you actually share with Roger Ebert, who at the time, I think rather unfairly, gives the film 1.5 stars. His opinion was that it was about as appropriate for smaller children as Jaws.
I think that's a bit much, but also I am someone who is terrified of Jaws. So I'm kind of like, Jaws is worse, but this is not too far under, if I'm being honest, personally.
Robin Williams would not take his youngest 2 children to see this at the time. They were about age 3 and 5 when it came out. So the star of this film did consciously avoid exposing his children to this until they were older. But honestly, BK, I think Jonathan Hyde, Van Pelt himself, might have the best take on the actual fear in the film. When he's asked about this, what he has said is that children love at some level to be frightened, and he thinks it's an important part of childhood. And I get what he's trying to say there. Honestly, a big part of life when you're a young person is that a lot of the world is unknowable, and it is by default scary because it's outside of your comfort zone and it's outside of your experience. But there's a certain excitement that comes with discovering something new and surmounting that fear. And there's a value to the way that Jumanji, as we've talked about, conveys that surmounting of fear. So I've got to be honest, for the fact that there are some genuinely scary moments in this film, I think Hyde's right. I think that being scared and coming through that fear is done very well in this setting and is very valuable to the makeup of this film.
I have to agree with you. I mean, I think that's probably why me and a lot of other fans of this film enjoy it so much. If it didn't have the surreal elements and the very horror-esque lens, I don't think it would have resonated as strongly with the cult following that it does have. I say cult, but 65 million.
It's a mainstream following, BK.
Yeah, it's it's a mainstream film, if we're being honest. But I know that the reception, though, wasn't shared, at least with critics, but I'm curious as to, like, why. I've only heard that.
Well, critics definitely did not like this movie, which I was genuinely surprised to discover when I went and just gave a cursory glance to what the reviews are. Most of the time, it seems like the criticism of this film shares a common theme, which is that they find the script to be too progressional. I mentioned it earlier in kind of a glib way when I talked about the board game moving us from set piece to set piece while these deeper morals are at play. But really, I don't think the critics saw past that progression in the story. I think at a surface level, it comes across to people like a video game. And if that's what turns you off, I can understand. But what I would say is that I don't think this film being beloved by fans the world over, and the fact that this is one of the larger divides online between critical and fan response, speaks well of the criticism that came out at the time. Because I tend to believe, and this is editorial, but I tend to believe that these critics missed the point.
I think so, too. I think it was very self-aware. I mean, one, it's referencing a child's book. Children's books are the most one set piece to set piece things I've ever experienced. But two, the whole movie is a board game. I think that's almost a play on it, almost an artistical is not a word. Oh, approach to interpreting that feel of progression through a game. How else to make the game feel like it's coming to life if life isn't mimicking that? And I think that it might have even been a little bit intentional.
More than a little bit intentional. We said it before, but this is a cast and crew that cared about making this film. And it's one that absolutely just exploded. And I think that it speaks to the fact that the things that we love about this film are so universal. It's a message that everybody is able to get behind. And so Jumanji, for as dated as the effects might end up looking at some point down the road, as much as it might seem like a time capsule of itself, Jumanji is always going to be a film that at its very core has value.
I feel like Jumanji really did kind of put a staple on what could be a weird, very first gaming film out there. You know what I mean? Like that's in my generations. I say that, but Tron exists.
So does Clue.
Yeah, Clue. Oh my gosh, you're right. And we did watch that too, didn't we, Jack?
Secret viewing.
Secret viewing. But it is true. There weren't a lot of them. And as a big nerd here, like a gamer, I think that's what resonates with me a little bit more too, is that tabletop element, that youthful feeling you get as someone who plays video games or board games or anything of that nature, regardless of your age, the mystery, but also the resolution. At the end, there is a winner. And I feel like you really feel like you won as the viewer by the time you get to the end of this film.
That's a very interesting observation. And I think it's something that is a big motivator and reason why this is something that ended up getting a reboot very recently. I think it's interesting that the reboot kind of reverses it. Instead of bringing the world to these characters and being in that kind of surrealist vibe, it instead brings the characters into a video game, which is a trope that we see pretty often in fiction. But I'm glad that there's been sufficient popularity to keep the name Jumanji alive and to keep people interested in it. And moreover, did you know that at very least in book lore, BK, this actually does have a direct sequel?
Wait, sequel? I mean, I know of a movie that is kind of similar, that's like all future and stuff, but I didn't know it was a sequel.
BK, that film you're thinking of might be a sequel. What film are you thinking of?
I'm thinking of Zathura.
Yes, it is.
Shut up! It's a sequel?
If you didn't know, it's not a direct sequel in the movie lore, but in the books, Chris Van Allsburg, at the end of Jumanji, Judy and Peter bring the board game back to the park, and they leave it there. But at the very, very end, as the mom comes home, she notices that two of the neighborhood boys have brought the board game home from the park, not knowing what it was. And in Zathura, the book begins with those two boys on the same street. So those are Judy and Peter's neighbors.
No way. I have to go back and watch it. Zathura was actually a decent movie as well. But now I'm also double interested in reading the books that I've never knew existed. I'm sure they're at like a library or something.
In my opinion, if you're going to raise a kid, you would be hard-pressed to find better books to put in front of them than the works of Chris Van Allsburg. And it's cool to be able to kind of come full circle in the pod at our end here and really just mention him again, and the fact that his creative force is something that has really bound people together. And I think that, again, Jumanji is just a film and a statement that will continue to bond together people for years to come.
It is such a great film. There are so many amazing elements in it, from finding out its story, from its conception, to honestly just learning about the details and doing into the research of everything. I mean, like, for me, as the weeaboo that I am, it's almost as if this film was quite literally made for me. So I always keep Jumanji in one of my tops and appreciate it at a newfound level. Now kind of just diving into it on the podcast with you and be able to like geek out about it at an intellectual level and not just experiential, because this film actually has so much to offer and I think might fall under the radar for some people. I'm talking to you youngins out there who might think this is a little too far past your time. I'm vomiting a little in my mouth saying that. I can't believe there are kids out there that listen to us. But if you're out there or you have kids that haven't seen this, get on top of it. Watch this film. Make it a thing. I'm telling you, you are going to enjoy this experience. Watch it again and go in there with your mind turned on instead of just being there for the ride, because there's a lot of great conversations and themes that stick out to you. And I feel like just hit home and it doesn't go away no matter how old this film gets to me. So I'm so glad we were able to dive in this today for our episode.
BK, I will just say this as a disclaimer, though. Next week, I would not recommend showing this film to your children, unless they're weird like my parents.
Wait, is next week the Monty whatever people?
Yes, it is.
Oh my God, Jack!
We are about to watch one of the funniest and most controversial comedies in film history. We could have started with Monty Python and the Holy Grail, but I thought to myself, everybody loves Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But I have a personal affection and am personally endeared to the 1979, my favorite film year, 1979's Life of Brian.
Am I supposed to? Yo, it's excitement. Woo. Life of. Is it like Jesus or something? I don't know.
I should explain this to our listeners here. BK is somebody who loves comedy when it's thrown into other genres, but she's not a pure comedy person. That's a blind spot for her.
A very big blind spot. I have missed comedies almost entirely, kind of very depressed about it. So I have heard a lot of how I've missed out on some gems. So Jack was so kind to be able to bring comedy to the podcast. And of course, if it's on the pod, we're going to watch it. So I have no excuse. I have to experience it with an open mind and heart, body and soul. And I will be jumping in to Life of Brian, Monty Python, Snake People.
BK, I predict that this is going to be one that you enjoy because it's a film that not only has a hell of a story and a lot of really interesting themes that undergird its satire, but it's also a film that literally set the world on fire with controversy. So I am so excited for the fact that this is your first ever Monty Python viewing, for the fact that it's something that you are bravely forging your way into. You don't know. You're a little scared if you're going to like it or not, but just like Jumanji, you're facing your fears, and we're going to show you some quality comedy next week.
I actually cannot wait, and I'm very excited. And we're also trying to open this viewing up to the community. So if you are interested in watch parties or just want to know what we're up to or when the latest episode is dropping, I highly recommend you follow us out on Twitter at RFN_podcast or on Instagram at Revenge of the Film Nerds. We are very active on Twitter there, getting our episodes out and tidbits and commenting all the news, all the films and all the things. So we will be first to post there when we've got stuff going on there. And I am quite literally shaking in my boots of excitement and joy to see the Life of Brian, Monty Snake Thons.
Don't worry, the enthusiasm will be genuine by next week, folks.
I can't wait to cut to boys' reactions before how it started, how it's going after we do our episode. No, but I am very excited. I can't wait. You always have smash hits, Space, so you actually have very high expectations, unfortunately. So I cannot wait to check this out and tell y'all all about it and learn about all the details and the controversy on our next episode. But until then, thank you so much for hanging out with us.
Wonderful time as always, BK.
I'll see you around.